It's been a while since I've made a video on Jonathan McIntosh. He seems pretty busy with his pop culture detective agency. Does anyone remember that video he did on privilege over at Feminist Frequency?
One of the luxuries of being a member of a privileged group is that the benefits afforded to us often remain invisible to us.
Now I know he's talking about gaming, but the privilege arguments extend far beyond that.
I do not have to carefully navigate my engagement with online communities or gaming spaces in order to avoid or mitigate the possibility of being harassed because of my gender.
I guess gender isn't a big deal when you're a man online. I mean, I don't think a man who talks about how privileged he is to be a man online would write a short blog post about the harassment men face online and how it's different from the harassment women face online. We all know if you're part of a privileged group, it shouldn't be a big problem. Let's be fair for 1 second though. It was also said in that video that men do get harassed.
This list is not meant to suggest that male gamers are always treated well.
Sometimes we are bullied,
or subjected to online nastiness.
Except for one thing.
but it's not based on or because of our gender.
Not based on or because of gender. No one would harass Jonathan McIntosh based on his gender. Here's what 72 hours of Twitter harassment looks like when men decide that another man isn't manly enough.
But it's not based on or because of our gender.
The ways men and women are harassed online are very different. When men are harassed, it tends to be all about trying to emasculate them.
But it's not based on or because of our gender.
It almost sounds like gender does play a role in harassment, whether you're male or female. While men are not harassed online in the same way or to the degree that women are, it's part of the cycle of abuse that we must break. When straight men are harassed, it's often rooted in homophobia and misogyny. We are attacked for defying patriarchal norms of masculinity. Jonathan makes privilege sound so wonderful till he's the main target.
When I enter an online game, I can be relatively sure I won't be attacked or harassed if and when my real-life gender is made public.
He can't hide behind Anita anymore, so now he has to convince people to care more about men who are harassed.
If I am trash-talked or verbally berated while playing online, it will not be because I am male, nor will my gender be invoked as an insult.
He ended up writing a long blog post about when men are harassed online.
If I choose to point out sexism in gaming, my observations will not be seen as self-serving, and will therefore be perceived as more credible and worthy of respect than those of my female counterparts, even if they are saying the exact same thing.
Maybe this is what happens when you focus almost exclusively on female harassment and spend years bragging about how privileged you are as a man. People don't take it as serious. Jonathan McIntosh is so privileged that I wonder if some of these feminists even care about his harassment. I'll be waiting for his TED Talk and his appearance on Colbert. It's not very difficult to get Jonathan's opinion on certain YouTubers.
Now, there are more than a few YouTube channels that claim to be concerned about men. Unfortunately, most of them are aggressively anti-feminist, and they just spend their time scapegoating and blaming women for everything. It is a really bad scene.
I think it's really important for us to work together in building a strong alternative to counterbalance the anti-feminist YouTube machine. Jonathan has this way of saying or doing things that really piss people off and then bragging about it, such as when he made that Donald Duck video about Glenn Beck.
That remix made one of these two cartoon characters very, very unhappy.
We're looking into the funding of this gentleman and the incredible propaganda against me.
And Jonathan McIntosh, he'll criticize everything. Video games, movies, television shows, comic books, and then he'll complain about his mentions on Twitter. It's like he has this lack of self-awareness that when you say dumb things or piss people off, there's going to be backlash. Would you be surprised in the slightest if I told you that Jonathan McIntosh makes ridiculous arguments? Most people would agree with me, but he would probably deny it. He's just a pop culture critic. All of his arguments are well thought out, rock solid, bulletproof. Well, it just so happens that I can give a great example using one of his favorite shows, Steven Universe. He's rewatched all 73 episodes.
This series is exceptional for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is because it's filled with powerful, confident women who are central to the show and its plot.
Powerful, confident women. We all know from tropes versus women in video games, it's very important how you frame women in media.
As a trope, the damsel in distress is a plot device in which a female character is placed in a perilous situation from which she cannot escape on her own and must be rescued by a male character. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero for the benefit of his story arc. No matter what we're told about their magical abilities, skills, or strengths, they're still ultimately captured or otherwise incapacitated and then must wait for rescue. The damsel in distress is not just a synonym for weak. Instead, it works by ripping away the power from female characters, even helpful or seemingly capable ones. Let's compare the damsel to the archetypal hero myth, in which a typically male character may occasionally also be harmed, incapacitated, or briefly imprisoned at some point during their journey. In these situations, the character relies on their intelligence, cunning, and skill to engineer their own escape. Or, just punching a hole in the prison wall works too. The point is, they're ultimately able to gain back their own freedom. A damseled woman, on the other hand, is shown as incapable of escaping the predicament on her own, and then must wait for a savior to come and do it for her.
Now sure, you could argue that I'm being disingenuous the way I cut and splice things around, especially considering Anita does say this in the video.
Now, I'm certainly not arguing that all stories must include completely fearless, hyper-individualistic, heroic women who pull themselves up by their bootstraps and never need anything from anyone. Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance.
So you could argue that the crystal gems only occasionally require rescuing by Steven Universe, but a lot of what happens to those women in that episode would fall under the criteria of what Jonathan considers problematic. To add insult to injury, back in 2015, Dying Light has a damsel in distress storyline. Dear game developers, it's 2015. Aren't you embarrassed by this yet? Apparently this was about a character named Jade, who although damseled at one point, was a capable female who rescued the main protagonist a few minutes into the game. When female characters appear capable before being damseled, it does not make it better, it makes it worse. It's literally disempowering. While the crystal gems seem pretty capable before being damseled, you just can't win with Jonathan. He will always alter the rules so he wins. Jonathan wants us to feel sorry for characters in media, especially video games.
Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings or emotions of another person. But empathy is not just feeling bad for someone else. It's actually feeling what they feel. And that's an important distinction. It's what separates sympathy from empathy.
Does anyone remember when he was talking about Pokemon? I get the appeal of collecting and evolving Pokemon, but the whole training your pets to fight thing is pretty unsettling. See how he wants us to feel sorry for them? He compares it to dog fighting, and considers the combat aspect to be disturbing. He received a torrent of mockery and abuse because it was unsettling to send this bird into a fight. Look at that. Don't you just feel sorry for that poor thing? I'd argue that maybe these things don't have feelings. Know who else would agree with me? For the millionth time, Cammy doesn't want anything. Her designers put her into a thong leotard to appeal to dudes. Once again, Cammy is fictional. She doesn't want anything. Her designers make all the choices about her character. He's referencing Cammy from Street Fighter for the unaware. Now, I'm not going to say you can't have an emotional connection with a well-written character or story, but the point I'm making is he wants us to empathize with fictional characters that have no feelings. Or to put it simply, I have a hard time feeling sorry for a Pokemon with no feelings in a simplistic game, no matter how cute it is. Jonathan, on the other hand, finds it very unsettling. Ever hear of bell hooks?
Because as Bell Hooks says, pop culture is where the pedagogy is. It's where the learning is happening.
Bell Hooks is an author Jonathan McIntosh is very fond of, And that is part of the reason Jonathan is so obsessed with how media influences people, because that is where the learning is happening. Now, one of Jonathan McIntosh's least favorite things in the world.
During your travels around the internet, you may have bumped into the term toxic masculinity. It usually shows up in connection with particularly abusive male behavior, so things like harassment, homophobia, sexism, or violent outbursts.
This phrase seems to get under a lot of people's skin because it is often thrown in the face of people Jonathan doesn't like, and he knows people are sick of hearing it.
Now, since there tends to be so much confusion and defensiveness surrounding these two words, I think we might need to start off with a really clear example. Something that we can all agree on. Okay, yeah. But honestly, I think he needs his own video, so maybe something else we...
What do you think you're doing?
Okay, that's gonna work. This charming fellow is Biff from the Back to the Future series.
Biff from Back to the Future. I think most people would agree he's a pretty toxic person. Thing that really caught my attention was bringing up Donald Trump. Before anyone turns this into a political discussion, I want to set that aside and take what Jonathan says at face value. I don't know if Jonathan knows this, but Biff was based on Donald Trump, or at least the Biff from Back to the Future Part 2, where he has the big hotel and all the money, the rich businessman Biff.
Since toxic masculinity is a set of behaviors and not a biological trait, the real men who participate are not really one-dimensional character archetypes like Biff, and they usually don't do all of the things on the list. Okay, well, sometimes they do, but usually that's not the case.
The way Jonathan does his double take, it makes me wonder if he did that for comedic value, or if he actually knows that Biff, the rich businessman Biff, was based on Trump. He also said in a tweet that he compared Donald Trump to Biff Tannen.
Alright, so let's return to our friend Biff here. Now, Biff is an obvious buffoon. I mean, he's a schoolyard bully, he's like a cartoon villain. His actions are easy to spot and understand as damaging, because really, toxic masculinity is what defines him as a character. At every point in Back to the Future, there might as well be a giant neon sign hanging over Biff's head that says, hey, this is the bad guy.
So it's painfully obvious the movie is trying to convey Biff as a bad character. As far as the comparison between Biff and Donald Trump, just keep that in mind for 1 second.
So we have to ask why. Why wasn't such blatant and unashamed misogyny a deal breaker? The answer, I'd argue, has a lot to do with the ways that our culture normalizes sexism. In the sociological sense, normalization is the process by which a particular attitude, ideology, or behavior becomes established and entrenched in social life.
Normalizing sexism. Jonathan is talking about what he refers to as the lovable misogynist.
This lovable misogynist archetype is found everywhere in pop culture.
These are the sexist characters that are framed in television as often being humorous. You laugh at what they're doing, even if you know it's wrong. Biff Tannen was framed as a bad guy, and part of that character is based on Trump. So if media is where the learning is happening, what are we learning? Is Trump a good or a bad guy? That he is likable or despicable? If a television show teaches us his behavior is acceptable, doesn't a movie teach us that his behavior is unacceptable? Jonathan McIntosh is obsessed with how media affects people. After decades of TV and movies starring belligerent assholes, I'm not sure why anyone is surprised voters are drawn to a belligerent asshole. See how he is blaming television shows and movies? On the other hand, and I'm gonna get a little bit political here, but let's just still take Jonathan at face value. He knows there are other reasons why people voted for that person. Disenfranchised working class white folks who like what he says about trade and jobs. Clinton supporters who dismiss poor and working class white voters. Democrats calling normal folks stupid is a losing strategy. Going through an entire year of Jonathan's tweets over this election cycle, he had a ton of tweets giving every reason in the world people would be drawn to Trump or feel disenfranchised with the Democratic Party or wouldn't vote for Hillary. Even one of his idols, Bell Hooks, couldn't support Hillary in the primaries.
I've talked a lot in these past few days about having once been a very pro-Hillary Clinton supporter, but finding at this stage of life and the stage of her politics that I can no longer be a Hillary Clinton supporter. in the name of feminism.
Jonathan was a Bernie Sanders supporter. He knows there was a hell of a lot more at play than just the TV shows and movies that we watch. Anyone remember that tweet he made about Star Wars Episode 7? Let's take a moment to consider the fact that the first trailer for the biggest, most anticipated movie of the decade features 0 white dudes. This was for the trailer, not the movie, just the trailer. This movie could have been complete garbage, and thankfully it wasn't, but he's that obsessed with representation. The point I'm making is Jonathan is too obsessed with the way media influences us, and that's why he has such a hard-on to stick it to media he doesn't like, because that's where the learning is happening. Even still, if everyone watched Back to the Future Part 2 the night before the election, where a representation of Trump is the bad guy, I highly doubt that would have changed the outcome. The real irony is while Jonathan McIntosh spent the last 5 years obsessing over video games, someone he views as dangerous talked his way into the White House. But look at the bright side, Jonathan. I'm sure that the world's problems will finally be solved because now we have better representation in video games. Jonathan McIntosh is a very difficult man to come to a middle ground with. Anyone who has ever argued with him knows how stubborn he is. Always start by demanding what you actually want, then compromise from there. If you start from what is realistic, you'll never get that. That sounds fair. It sounds like someone who understands you'll never get everything that you want. Always start from your actual goal, especially if your opponents are extreme. That way you'll get more of what you want in the final deal. Jonathan is actually an extremist. I think what he asks out of the video game industry is far more excessive than what is realistically feasible. But let's just assume for 1 second that you give Jonathan what he wants. You think he'd be content with that? Back in 2014, he criticized the lack of female diversity in Overwatch. Take a look at the Overwatch female character designs. All have identical body types. 4 out of 5 have sexualized outfits. In response to this sort of criticism, Blizzard added Zarya and eventually Mei. However, that isn't good enough. You see, Jonathan wants to see more LGBT representation. So a while back, Blizzard announced that Tracer was a lesbian. You'd think Jonathan would be ecstatic over that. You know, Blizzard, maybe don't make your first openly lesbian character in Overwatch be one that's specifically designed for the male gaze. Blizzard is trying to provide character diversity without alienating their straight male fan base. They want their cake and to eat it too. Tracer is actually one of the faces of Overwatch. She's heavily used for promoting the game, and was the first Overwatch character added to the Blizzard multi-universe game Heroes of the Storm.
The name's Tracer, and the Nexus could always use more heroes.
The fact they made what some could be considered their flagship character for Overwatch their first openly lesbian character actually is a risky move, but they managed to pull it off. I'd say what Blizzard did was actually very smart, but for Jonathan, it isn't good enough. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. Ever see how Jonathan talks about violence in video games? This guy is borderline obsessed with how violence is framed in media. To play on my previous point about compromise, Jonathan would like to give you the impression he's a reasonable person. But is he reasonable with his suggestions? It's true some games include non-combat options, still, the message that violence and non-violence are equal paths to a goal is pernicious. Violent video games send a message that violence is a valid choice. You know, the violent video games that don't make people violent, those games. Also, that violence is framed as fun. This right here is one of the biggest cruxes of Jonathan's ideology. Realistically, you'd have to change the concept of what fun is. And this doesn't just involve having more diverse games with different play styles and game mechanics. It would mean fundamentally altering the idea of what the average person finds fun. Most men find violent media fun. Violent games, violent movies, violent television shows, a lot of us find those to be fun. Jonathan doesn't. So let me ask something. If most blockbuster video games are like bad action movies, Do you think gaming studios need a moratorium on all fighting mechanics until they figure out how to do interactive stories about human connections? Do any of you even know what the word moratorium means? A suspension of activity, an authorized period of delay or waiting. This sounds pretty drastic to me. Right, because criticism of how war is framed in some games is exactly the same as calling for a prohibition. So Jonathan doesn't want a prohibition on violent video games, he just wants a moratorium. That's so much better than a prohibition. Jonathan is the kind of person who also wants you to believe there is no fight against fun. Who cares if he thinks major studios need a moratorium against making what most gamers find fun? According to Jonathan, there is no war against fun. All these games at E3 2016 are boring. All these games at E3 2016 are boring. There is too much combat in these games. Fun is actually subjective. One person's idea of fun is not necessarily another person's idea of fun. But then you have what most people find fun, or to be more specific, what most gamers find fun. We'll further specify and say what most hardcore gamers who play big budget games find fun. These big budget gaming studios make what those gamers find fun. But Jonathan finds this to be a problem because he doesn't see those games as fun. In order to change the perspective of society as a whole, they'd all have to believe a lot of the things Jonathan does. Someone could easily live their entire life in Jonathan's shoes, but be a completely different person at the end of the day. Or to put it simply, they'd have a different opinion on what fun is. Anyone familiar with the old saying that it's both possible and even necessary
to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects?
One of the problems with video game criticism is that most critics feel the need to present themselves first and foremost as fans. And then Jonathan has an entire thread saying things like, gamers should feel uncomfortable with certain critiques. It's not his job to try and please people who are fans of what he's critiquing. But this is one of the problems with social justice critiques of media. You have people who aren't consumers of certain games that are trying to tell people who do buy those games what's right or wrong with them. Gaming as a medium will be forever relegated to the cultural toy aisle unless the industry moves beyond killing stuff as its core focus. When you start crossing that line of redefining what fun is to gamers, you're asking gaming studios to pander to people who don't even play those games. If you make some of the changes Jonathan wants, you won't necessarily see an increase in sales. On the contrary, if you make a game less fun to gamers, you might see a decrease in sales. As some of you may know, Jonathan likes the idea of male characters crying in media, but he'll back up these claims with science.
Incidentally, when I say that crying is healthy, I mean that quite literally, in both the physiological and the psychological sense. Because tears are one of the best ways to relieve stress.
Now, if you ask Jonathan what he means by that, he can actually give you scientific explanations on why crying is a good way to release stress. Let's give Jonathan the benefit of the doubt and say he has a point. Jonathan also has issues with the claims that violent video games release stress. The adrenaline rush you get from violent games feels good in the short term, but it's not releasing stress. Adrenaline is a stress hormone. Games that make you cry would be better at relieving stress. Again, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and just assume violent video games don't have a long-term effect on releasing stress. Which is not to say there's nothing good about games, I'm just annoyed that the violence as stress reliever myth is constantly repeated. Let's just focus on this for 1 second. He is concerned with the myths about video games other people spread. Someone who cherry-picks examples, uses manipulative language, doesn't hold himself to his own standards, and makes arguments that contradict themselves. He, of all people, is concerned about the myths that other people spread. Jonathan's main shtick is criticizing things that he considers problematic. I think there are plenty things about Jonathan McIntosh that are problematic. Jonathan has tried to engage respectfully with criticism made in good faith by people who aren't insulting him. The folks sincerely pointing out that any issue with Tracer are best left up to queer folks to deconstruct are correct. My apologies. Remember when I was talking about his critique of Tracer earlier? Remember how insufferable he was being? Jonathan is the perfect example of somebody getting offended at something that isn't offensive to the people who are supposed to be offended. Even still, does Jonathan come across as someone who deals with critics who make arguments in good faith? Does he come across as the kind of person who would compromise or find a middle ground? Or is it possible that Jonathan McIntosh is as problematic as the things that he criticizes?